What is going on, everybody? This is Brandon from ComixKings. Welcome, everybody, back to the kingdom, or welcome if this is your first time. I know I'm never here on any Friday afternoon. I never do anything in the afternoon, really, but I had to make an exception today because I am joined by the incredibly talented writer, RamV. How you doing today, sir?
Good, good. I'm glad to be on. I'm glad we could make this work.
Yeah, me too. It's always difficult when different time zones, even like
Yeah,
in the United
yeah.
States, let alone across seas. But thank you so much for making this work. You have been
My pleasure.
insanely busy. You've been putting out a lot of great work. The Many Deaths of Laila Starr, one of my personal favorites, a lot of my friends' personal
Thank
favorite.
you.
Justice League Dark, and which would put me onto your work. Swamp Thing, which has been phenomenal, and Catwoman, and then a project coming up in the fall,
hmm
Venom. How do you
hmm
do? How do you manage all of that just to begin with?
Always panicked and running low on sleep.
Running low on sleep and a lot of. How's the coffee out there where you are?
Good. I think I must be running like about a quarter of the industry based on what I've been drinking. But um, no, it's genuinely a matter of like I haven't been doing this very long. I started working in comics really in 2016. So um, when I got to this point, I think it was like end of 2020, end of 2019, maybe, where I looked at it and I said, "Oh crap! I've said yes to a lot of things," and yeah, it's a matter of personal pride not to let anything sort of drop off in quality or drop off in terms of deadlines and stuff. So it's been rough, kind of keeping all those plates spinning, but and I've kind of taken stock of that in recent times. So I've kind of gone back to my editor and say, hey, you know, I can only do so much. Um, but it's been that sense of like I was super enthusiastic about telling stories. I said yes to everything, and you have to kind of hit your own personal wall before you know where your limits are.
Right.
Yeah.
100%. So you said you got into comics 5 years ago. What got you into writing comics, or what got you to say, "Hey, I want to do this," or go into this medium?
Yeah, I mean, I've discussed this, on interviews and stuff before, but I wasn't actually like a, avid reader of comics when I was a kid or anything. Partly because comics were hard to come by in India. Certainly, the more Western European comics were hard to come by. I used to read a lot of the sort of old Phantom, Flash Gordon, Mandrake, that kind of stuff. Um, and then I stopped reading comics for a really long time, and I moved to the States to study chemical engineering. When a friend of mine, and I believe this was like 2003 or something, a friend of mine kind of gifted me the first volume of Sandman for my birthday, and it was really reading that book that pulled me back into comics. I read everything Gaiman had done after that. I read everything Moore had done, Morrison, Ellis, Ennis. So really kind of fell down that late 80s, early 90s Vertigo hole, if you will.
Right.
Um, and by the time I came out the other side, I was like, yes, I want to write a comic at some point. Um, but that didn't really happen until 2020, 2013 is when I quit chemical engineering and decided to start writing full time. I wrote mostly short stories and prose, and then I wrote a comic in India for a while. Um, and then I moved to the UK to study writing in 2014. And by the time I was finished with that course, I started working on my first kind of internationally published book, if you will, or self-published book, which is called Black Mumba. And that's really the book that got me started on the road to what I'm doing today.
That's awesome, man. That book, I've heard of it. It's going on. It's been on my radar. I just have not picked it up yet.
Mm-hmm.
For me, I started reading in probably like 2016, 2015.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I read a comic before. It was a Star Wars Dark Horse from the Old Republic that my
Mm-hmm.
grandma bought me. Then I went to a con with my buddy of mine, and he gave me $5. Said pick 5 books, and I picked five characters that I liked, all different, and just dove in there. So that's what I did. But big shout out to the chat today. Thank you so much for spending your time here with us on this lovely Friday afternoon or Friday evening if you're over in the UK with Rom V. Make sure you guys hit the thumbs up, subscribe to the channel if you guys are new. A lot of great things have been going on and a lot more announcements yet to come, so stay tuned for that. I appreciate all the support. Real quick, but Ram, Many Deaths Laila Starr just came out, just finished.
Yeah.
What would be your pitch to anyone who has not read it yet?
Death gets fired because there's a child who's born on Earth who will one day invent immortality. And so she's sent down to Earth, having been fired as the goddess of death. And the first thing she does is try to kill this child, but is unable to do so. And then the story follows her journey as she and this child's lives crisscross paths at regular intervals. And by the end, perhaps she learns a little bit about humanity and mortality through the living her many lives across these issues.
Right. As we were going through this book, it was very subtle of how much more feeling she was able to give out, right, and how much she was able to perceive in the book leading up until the end
Mm-hmm.
with Darius. Do you think that what is like your take on that? Because I know there are a lot of religious aspects or cultural aspects in this book. If you can talk about that for us.
Well, I mean, when I first started out writing the story, the obvious question was, why am I writing about death when Gaiman probably wrote the most famous personification of death in all of comics? And I think in my head, at least, the reason that I came up with was, yeah, because death is a uniquely cultural, personal thing, right? Like the way people in India and Hindus perceive death is very different from the way Buddhists perceive death. Is very different from the way an American looks at death. It's very different from the way someone in the UK looks at death. And so, although it is incredibly universal, it's also incredibly personal. And I think at the intersection of those things is where my story was. And I felt like I had something to say about this kind of very authentic Indian look at death, despite that authenticity really talking about something that everyone could identify with, regardless of where they were from. So I think stories need to do that. I think stories need to become windows into things that we haven't seen before, we haven't experienced before, and yet windows that connect those things to things that we are intimately familiar with.
Right. Right. Something that we're already familiar with in like a religious aspect, cultural aspect, because everyone's been hurt by death. Everyone has kind of studied it to a degree or like kind of questioned what they're going through with that. So this is definitely a great narrative. It's like one of my favorite parts of the book was after you die, yes, your body dies, but your soul lives on through the memories that you are created. To me, that really stood out. I believe that was in the fourth issue.
It was
That
the
quote
second
was
one, yeah.
that was in the
Yeah,
second. That was in the second one.
yeah.
Okay. Um, well, what was kind of like your personal take on that quote?
Yeah, I mean, I've contemplated these things, as I'm sure other people have. It's one of the great sort of existential questions of life, right? And more often than not, you come across examples in history of people doing both wonderful and terrible things because they want to leave behind a legacy. And I think it was that it was really talking about that and looking at that I wanted to talk about, which is, your legacy is not some material object that you're going to leave behind, or not some idea or philosophy, because all of those things change. All of those things, like, people might have valued, you know Marx or Hegel at one point, and don't think people value them the same way anymore, and I don't think people view those people and their ideologies the same way anymore. So the world constantly changes. So really, the only thing matters is the very personal, the very intimate memories and experiences that you leave behind,
Right.
because those are indicative of you as a person rather than your work or your legacy or whatever you want to call it. Yeah.
Right. Right. Another subject that you just kind of touched on is how do we make memories? How do we create those intimate moments with each other? And the great thing about this book is that it makes you think about those things in life. Now, you could be remembered. Someone could remember you by if you just complimented their shirt and made their day. Right. You never
Yeah.
really know the impact that you are going to have on a person So I guess like in this book, what Layla was doing is kind of just being the best she could be, or just having the best impact that she could have on everyone to create those memories, to create those intimate moments.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's simplifying it a little bit in that, yeah, it's important to be nice, but I think the thing that I'm getting at more, and I think the thing that the story is getting at, is it's important to care.
Right,
Like
right,
when Layla first comes down, she cares about nobody other than herself and her job, because she knows nobody else other than herself and her job. Not in that sort of intimate way that people who know they've got a finite amount of time on this planet, when they get to know each other, they get to know each other knowing that one day I won't exist and you won't exist, you know? Um, and so I think the real journey that she goes through the rest of the issues is that she learns to care. And sometimes you may do nice things for the people you care. Sometimes you may have to do things that are not particularly nice, but you do them anyway because you care. You know, calling out someone's bullshit, or pushing them when they need a voice in their head to go like, no, you can do this. Go on, take some pains. Get off your ass and get things done.
right,
Those are not necessarily nice things that you do for someone. Those are not necessarily compliments, but I think people remember those things. I remember those things. I remember the people who pushed me, who picked me up on my collar and said, "Get off your ass and get stuff done" when I needed it. Um, so I think more than being nice or being kind is caring, genuinely caring.
right. And that's something that a lot of people today, it's harder to grasp. It's something you don't really teach in grade school or growing up. Is something you pick up, is the ability to care, the ability to empathize with other people, but also the ability to kind of, like you said, be that stern person for someone, to be that person that someone needs,
Yeah,
right? If it's somebody nice, or if it's someone who needs kind of an ass kicking. Um, like you said, as a martial artist, as a body teacher, that's something that for each student I'd have to look at and say, okay, what does this student need me to be, right?
right.
What is, because that's different for every person, because everyone has a different situation.
Yeah, yeah, and sometimes you can see people have the desire to do things, but are afraid of taking that leap. And sometimes it's a matter of going like, what's the worst that's going to happen? You're going to fall. You're going to get hurt. I'll be there when you fall. I'll be there when you get hurt. So take that leap. You know.
Right,
So sometimes it's just a matter of being there. And I think all of those things are important. And I think just looking at the way the world has gone over the past few years, I felt like, hey, this is not this world where we keep getting angry at each other is not the real world. The real world exists where people care for each other, and there are things that are universally important, and things that strike a chord with humanity rather than your personal likes or dislikes. And so that's vaguely, nebulously, the kind of things that I was trying to touch upon with the story.
right, right. And you did a great job. I personally loved all the foil covers that came out. I know you didn't draw them, but um,
Boom, and
that
those foil covers, they're very excellent.
they were perfect. Got every single one of them. How did you pitch this to Boom Studios, or did you want to take it to Image first? So, how did you get this story the life it gave us?
No, it was. I remember having a chat with. I didn't particularly pitch this. I had a chat with Eric Harburn at the bar at San Diego Comic Con. I think 2019 or 2018. I can't remember which year. And Eric was like, "Look, I'd like to work with you. Do you have any ideas?" And I remember mentioning a few ideas here and there. And I know Eric said, "We want something that's very much in the vein of Graffiti's Wall," which is a book that I'd done previously. Um, and that was a very slice of life kind of young teenagers living in Mumbai kind of book. But he said, we want some fantastical genre sci-fi aspect to it. And I'd already been sort of mulling over this idea of a story where the Indian god of death gets sent down to Earth to live among the mortals, and those two things just kind of fit in together at the time. So I sent him an outline, um, and Eric got back and was like, "Yeah, this is great. Let's define the issues a little bit more." I shared the pitch that I sent him on a recent newsletter where I was talking about my ideas of pitching, if you will. But yeah, that's kind of how that came about.
That's great to hear, and then obviously joined by Felipe Andrade, who did a fantastic job.
Mm-hmm.
I do like this question a lot. Were there any obstacles you faced as you pitch concepts and characters based in India to Western publishers or creators?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, my first book was based in India. It was black and white crime noir, Black Mumba. I pitched that around to a bunch of companies, and some of them were straight up like, "Look, this is great. We enjoyed it, but we don't know who we would sell this to, or how we would sell this, because it's black and white. It's based in Mumbai. It's based around India, and we don't know that there is a readership for that." And then it was Chris Daros, I think, at Top Shelf, who said, you should just self-publish this because this is excellent work. And at the time, nobody had told me that my work was excellent. So I really took that to heart, and I said, okay, you know what, I'm going to self-publish this. I think we funded that via Kickstarter and raised quite a bit of cash to print and publish that book. And then once that book was out and seeing the kind of response it got, obviously then that opened a lot of doors for me. And I remember a couple of years that later I was pitching stuff and they were like, no, don't pitch us any of that stuff. Pitch us more India, Mumbai stuff. I was like, oh, now you come around.
Now you want what you just rejected me from.
Yeah, but I mean, I understand that's how things work with large publishing houses. No one wants to take a risk, um, you know. But as a creator, that's literally your job. Your job is to take creative risks. So,
Right. And what would you say the biggest risk you did take in your career thus far?
I don't know about biggest, but I like taking risks with every story.
Right.
You know, Swamp Thing pitch. I said, yeah, let's put aside Alec Holland. Let's start with a new Swamp Thing. Let's take Levi. And I was immediately questioning, like, oh, why are we doing that? It's gonna make a bunch of people angry. It's like, no, I don't want to get angry if the stories are good. Uh, and I think that's really been kind of my ethos throughout, which has been to say everything should have an element of risk to it. Otherwise, it's just boring and you've
Right.
seen stuff before. And everything, because it has that element of risk, should also be executed with the greatest amount of care. Because if you take a risk but you execute it with a lot of care, people will forgive your failures because it's still apparent that you tried to do something interesting. If you do something mediocre and it's just kind of passable, then you might not have failed, but people will never remember what you did. And I have no interest in writing something that's not going to be remembered, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years from now.
Right. Right. Well said. And you just touched on Swamp Thing, which is going to be the next segment kind of this show. So DC was going into future state. Did you already have plans going into 5G before that kind of got housed, or what was kind of the situation going on with Swamp Thing at the time?
Yeah, my Swamp Thing pitch was really part of 5G, where the group editors had come to me and said, look, here's a list of characters that we're all kind of discussing various possibilities with. If there are any characters in here that you'd like to pitch, send us a few. And I went back with like, no, I'm not sending you a few. I'm going to send you one pitch for Swamp Thing. And I sent them a pitch for Swamp Thing, and they got back to me. They said, yeah, editorial loves this, so we're going to do it. And then 5G kind of fell by the wayside, and I think plans got changed. But I think editorial interest in the pitch continued to stay quite strong. You know, I know that when Dan Didio and Bob Harris were there, they were both quite excited by the pitch. And then when that changed and Marie came in, and then there were group editors with Jamie, and Alex Carr was my editor on the book, they were still quite excited about that pitch. And so that was to me very heartening, that here's a pitch that had gone through two sort of regimes, if you will, and it
Right.
continued to be valued by editorial. So
Right. And it's incredibly valued by the readers.
yeah, yeah, and again, it is one of those. I like to tell this anecdote. I don't think the expectations were that the book would do as well as it has done so far. And I kept going like, no, it doesn't matter who the main character is, whether it's Halleck Holland or not, doesn't matter. You know, how many big splashy superhero appearances we're throwing into the book. What will matter is that the stories feel like they're new, they're interesting, and they're well told. And you know, fortunately, I was working with collaborators and editors who were very much on the page with me about that. Um, and when that issue one came out, just seeing the kind of response readers had to it, and I gotta say, I gotta tip my hat to people who were just out there going like, everybody needs to buy this because we need a season two coming in. So more news on that front shortly, but yeah.
Y'all may have heard it first here. Yo.
I didn't say anything. I just said more news. So stay tuned.
We are staying tuned. For me, like I said, I didn't have a Swamp Thing book coming out when I started reading. I think a lot of people who started was probably the New 52 with Charles Soule or Scott Snyder when they took over. But before that, it was really Alan Moore. Really the next like big seminal run. I mean, we had the Len Wein one shot, which was fantastic. But what this story has done is it's taking the same vibes from the Vertigo run, where very similar, and the anatomy is so well done. And the art, everything is so, it feels so fresh. With a new character, it's not like we're just introducing character, we're telling a story, we're kind of switching gears, and we're creating a great environment to bring this new character into.
Yeah.
I think the question another question that I had is, how will Levi kind of work his way into DC continuity or get into the future state? Because I know he's crossing over with Suicide Squad. What's gonna happen following that?
So I don't really do story spoilers or story predictions. You'll have to read and find out. But I think the intention very much. I mean, I will say this: if you go back and look at the Alan Moore run, which to me is certainly one of the most influential seminal runs in comics. Period. Um, if you go back and look at that run, he wasn't shy about Swamp Thing kind of mingling with the DCU. I believe there was an issue with Batman. There's a story with Superman involved. I believe there was a story with all the DC Magic characters like Phantom Stranger and Zatanna and Deadman. Right. So he wasn't shy about throwing Swampy into situations where you wouldn't otherwise find him. And I think that has always been my kind of weather vane, if you will, in that, okay, when my editors came to me and they said, hey, Suicide Squad crossover, I said, yes, let's do it. I've never been shy of involving him in the DCU, but also with much like everything else with this series, I would much rather that happens organically than someone shows up and says, Swamp Thing, we're recruiting you for this thing. And he goes like, okay, I'm going with you, even though I've never met you before. Yeah, I don't like doing things that way. I'd much rather there be like a story-based motivation for him to get involved with stuff. And so I tend to build those things into story rather than sort of make them happen on the spur of the moment, if you will.
Right. The Suicide Squad kind of crossover has kind of been generated over a few issues now. And I'm excited to see how he does eventually. Because in Future State, he was running with the Justice League Dark, which is one of your first weeks that we'll get into in just a bit.
He wasn't. No, there was a Swamp Thing Future State that was separate, and he wasn't really with Justice League Dark in the Future State books.
Right.
So there was a completely separate Swamp Thing Future State run. So.
Right. There were two different stories.
Yeah. Right. And I think there is some interest in terms of how does this current slate of events lead to that future state. So.
Right. But for those who have not read it, what would be kind of your way of saying, go read this book? What would you kind of pitch it again to everyone who's kind of been trade waiting it, or how can you get them excited to find that out? Because the trade comes out pretty soon, which collects, I believe, the first two future
First
state
five and yeah, first five
and the
issues
future
and two
state.
future state. Yeah.
Yes.
Um, I'll pitch to you the way by telling you what interested me in writing this character. Um, I was a huge fan of horror in comics, and especially kind of intelligent, introspective horror. And I felt like we'd kind of lost that in the big two universes for quite some time. Of course, until recently with Immortal Hulk, which Al Ewing did, which is a splendid example of that. But I wanted to bring a kind of body horror that was about someone changing in very tangible, painful, and very visceral ways. And I wanted to parallel that with the story of someone who felt out of his skin in his everyday life and was changing even in his daily life into something else. And I think that's the journey that Levi is on. And so, if you want to read a story about a new DCU character that has elements of intellectual body horror placed alongside a genuine story about human change, then go pick up Swamp Thing. I hope it will remind you in all the best ways about what this character can be in terms of its potential for stories.
Right. And we were talking about earlier backstage how this felt like a DC Vertigo story. That was like
Mm-hmm.
the first issue. That's exactly what you reminded me of Alan Moore's run, which that's high praise enough saying go read this book. But what are your kind of thoughts? Was this intended to kind of say I miss Vertigo, or were you trying to include some of those Vertigo elements?
I mean, I think the reason Vertigo, I think we need to look at it from the other way around. The reason Vertigo is so popular and so storied and talked about is that it did something new with the comics that were out at the time, which is it said, look, comics can be fun, they can be weird, they can be interesting, they can be punchy, they can have superheroes, and they can also do intelligent, interesting, heartfelt, touching things. It doesn't have to be an either or situation. And that's frankly the argument that I give everyone. You know, people come to me and they say, "Oh, this series is just fun." And I say, "Yes, but why does just fun also mean that it doesn't have to be good? You know, fun can also be good. Fun can also
Right.
be intelligent. Fun can also be interesting."
Fun can
Um,
also have a lot of depth and character development
yeah,
and world
yeah,
building.
and I think that's what Vertigo did, and Vertigo showed at the time was that you could do that level of nuance and depth with comics. Um, and I felt like for the longest time, after that sort of late 80s, early 90s Vertigo, there had come a time where those kinds of creators had kind of stepped away from comics for quite some time. And I've also felt like comics as an industry didn't go out and seek more of those kind of creators. Um, my whole motivation for getting into comics was really reading, you know, Hellblazer and Sandman. So it's totally unsurprising that everything I do comes from that motivation. But it's less of a desire to emulate Vertigo and more of a desire to say that no, hold on, comics can be multi-layered, interesting, weird, multifaceted things that can make you really think about life and think about your reality and think about humanity in the way that, I mean, my comics still have people punching each other, but if you're doing a comic just about people punching each other, why? When you can do a comic about people punching each other while talking about the great existential questions of being human, you know?
Right, 100%. I'm with you, and that kind of reminded me of Batman Damned that came
Mm,
out
mm,
a few years ago
mm.
by Azzarello and Libermejo, which is basically a very psychedelic Batman story. Whereas, like, where you walk away and you question, like you question yourself, you question what you're going through, And those are really the best kind of comics, are the ones
Yeah,
that
and
make you think.
I also think that one of the great hallmarks of really interesting, really good comics is that they do aesthetically very unique things. Like there may be a million Sandman lookalikes in comics after the success of Sandman, but reading Sandman tonally and aesthetically feels like its own unique thing. And I genuinely think that it was in that era of Vertigo that we had the most amount of different aesthetic uniqueness in comics. Like, Shade the Changing Man was different from 100 Bullets, was different from Human Target, was different from Swamp Thing, was different from Sandman.
Right.
And I think if we looked at modern day comics now, I think that kind of diversity still exists. That kind of difference in storytelling still exists, but largely within a certain genre, things seem to kind of follow the same path. Like I can't tell you what post apocalyptic comic I read that did something new with post apocalypse. Um, and I think there's a real need for that. I think there's a real need for young, 20, 30-year old storytellers to come in and go like, I have something new to say. And Vertigo really facilitated that more than created anything or sort of engendered anything, in my opinion.
100%, man. Now, have you been able to kind of work with the creative teams that you've been blessed on a lot of these books? Mike Perkins, who's been in the industry for a while, Mike Spicer, a fantastic colorist, even Felipe Andrade,
Yeah.
and later coming down the road, Al Ewing, Brian Hitch, um, Alvaro Martinez Bueno, Kyle Holtz. Have you been able to kind of maintain these relationships and work with your different creative teams?
I mean, I think that's really part of the gig with comics, isn't it? In that if you can't collaborate, then you're in the wrong medium. And I think my inclination in comics has always come from a more visual side of things. I have always been interested in the visual side of things on a page, even if I'm just writing the script. Um, and some artists appreciate that, some artists don't. But I'm also an exceptionally charming and sweet person, so uh, so I've made those things work. Largely, my artists, even if there have been certain hesitations in the beginning, have come to a point in my relationship with them where I think we find each other exciting. Like I don't worry about sending Mike Perkins some visual idea that I had, knowing entirely that if he doesn't think it's gonna work, he's just gonna go like, nah, that's not gonna work. And it's fine. And it's totally fine to do that. But I think the fact that he's willing to consider it from someone who can't possibly compare when it comes to actually drawing things, speaks very highly to that person's ability to collaborate. And I think I've largely been blessed with artists who have all been able to do that. I mean, Alvaro is like the sweetest person imaginable.
Right. Right. I've
Um,
talked to him a few times. He's awesome.
yeah, yeah, and then working with some of my own creator-owned books with Anand RK, who won the Eisner for Blue and Green recently, uh, or Sumit Kumar, who's been on the JLD backups with me now. Um, they've all had that sort of golden quality in Noodles, which is the ability to listen to someone who is clearly not as good as them at drawing, but still has interesting ideas. Hopefully,
Right. And like you said earlier, the beauty of comics is the ability to collaborate and grow together and create
yeah,
a
it's like
bunch
being
of,
in a band.
yeah.
You could be the world's greatest vocalist, but if you can't make it work with your guitarist and your bassist and your drummer, if you have ego issues when it comes to that, it's just not going to work.
Justin Timberlake would just love to hear you say that right now. But anyway, Justice League Dark, first collaborating with James Tynion, was there always kind of a plan for you to take over the book when it came to a head, or how did you get on the book in the first place?
Well, my first real work with JLD was when I did the annual. and
Right.
James had read D7 Shores, I believe, and he said, "Hey, I read D7 Shores, really enjoyed it. We're looking for someone to write the annual for the series that I'm writing. Do you wanna write an annual? It's largely going to be a Swamp Thing story, um, and I think you'd do a great job," is what he said. And I went back to him. I said, "Yeah, yeah, you had me at Swamp Thing." Um, so I went back to him, and the process of collaborating with him was great. Brittany Holzer was the editor on the book at the time, and she was super welcoming as well. I sent them an outline based off of ideas that James and I had discussed, and it was pretty straightforward from there. And the response to that annual was really great. People were like, "Oh, this felt like reading Vertigo all over again," which is kind of what I'd wanted. Um, and so after that, when James decided to move over to Batman, um, he came up to me and said, "Look, I'm going to be taking over Batman, at some point, and that means I can't continue doing this book. So, do you want to just take on the end of Justice League Dark?" And I said, "Yeah, yeah, bring it on." I had always been sort of in love with the magic side of DCU. Based off of reading mostly Vertigo, also like all of the Grant Morrison stuff he did with Seven Soldiers. So, yeah, it seemed it came at the right time, and it was the right place for me to kind of dive in with both my feet into DCU.
Right. Did you have to do a whole lot of research in the characters other than Constantine and Swamp Thing? But you had other characters like Zatan in there. You had Animal Man kind of coming in there.
I mean,
You
I
had
had
Wonder
read
Woman.
most of these things before. I
Right.
said I'd read a lot of Morrison, so Morrison had touched on a lot of these characters for Seven Soldiers. He'd written the seminal run on Animal Man, of course. Um, I'd read Doom Patrol, so I knew kind of what flavors I wanted to pull in with a lot of those. I had read Kingdom Come, so I had some idea of what I wanted to do with characters like the Spectre. I'd read Swamp Thing, so I'd read, Phantom Stranger and Deadman. So it wasn't a matter of me doing a lot of research. Frankly, I pull from more things that are outside of comics than within comics because I feel that's part of
Right.
what makes my work feel like it's new. Um, yes, that's true.
Right.
So yeah, I had read a lot of Grant stories and Alan stories, and I found them to be quite instructive, and I didn't feel like I needed to do much more research
Right.
beyond that.
Right. I think the most interesting question of talking to creators is where they get their research from and how they're able to bring in multiple aspects of different mediums, whether that's using like different scripts, like, okay, this costume, like from similar to, let's say, Game of Thrones or similar to this movie. I always find that very interesting and how creators are able to understand each other through that, or really able to how they're able to use different aspects, like I said, of different mediums to tell a story.
Hmm.
Um, to really add to characters into the story that they're telling.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like you have to read and view and consume widely across all mediums to be able to really tell stories. If you're only reading comics, I feel like you're missing a few notes when it comes to being able to make comics. Yeah.
100%. And then going forward, we talked about how Just League Dark gets in the backup stories right now of Just League by Brian Michael Bendis, but it will be collected in a graphic novel for people who are trade waiting it. How would you say that's going, or the pitch for that for those who are not reading it in the backup stories?
I mean, it's just a magical romp kind of tour of all of the DCU's underexposed and underexplored magic corners, if you will, um, with an Arthurian twist because I wanted to bring back Merlin into the DCU, which I'd always found to be an interesting character. Um, so yeah, for the trade waiters, I would say I wrote these backups with the intention of being 10-page stories. And so they are absolutely packed full of ideas and concepts and just crazy amounts of fun. So,
Right. I like this question as well. How different are the struggles when you work on an original story and world and when you work within an existing universe?
I don't think. I mean, the struggle's always ever present, right? Like, because you're always struggling to try and tell a good story. Um, but this is something that I feel like all of my favorite writers have been able to do. Um, like if you see Alan Moore's work, uh, if you see Neil Gaiman's work, um, whether it is more personal stuff, even if you see Grant's work, whether they're writing creator owned or rather than creator owned, whether they're writing original content or they're writing stories in the DCU, they've always been able to infuse it with a sense of your own, a voice of your own. There's no mistaking a Grant Morrison story for someone else's. There's no mistaking a Neil Gaiman story for someone else's. Um,
I would love to see Ron write a Dune book. If you could write a book, if you could say yes to another project, what is one story that you would love to do later on in the industry?
I mean, I always struggle with answering this question because I don't get excited about because the only way I can answer that without actually telling you the story is to say what character it involves or what world it involves or what franchise. And I don't get excited by those things. The thing that I do get excited by is when I have an idea that really works for a certain character. And sometimes what that means is, I'll go to DC or Marvel and I'll say, hey, I've got this excellent story for this character that you haven't published in 50 years and no one's heard of. And usually that means that book's not going to get made because there isn't enough of a readership. But in time, you never know. If it gets to a point where, and we're already seeing that happen, gets to a point where people trust the fact that I'm writing a book. And so they will pick up a book because they know it'll be interesting because I'm writing it rather than picking
Right.
up a book because it's a Superman book or because
Right.
it's a Batman book.
I was gonna say readership today has been very subjective. When Jeff Lemire was writing Sentry a few years ago in Marvel, there really hasn't been a readership for that character since
Yeah.
Bendis stopped really utilizing him in his
Yeah.
Avengers, or with Tom King with Mister Miracle, and look how that book has been doing. It's one
Yeah.
of one of the best modern comic book stories across the board.
Mm-hmm.
Same thing with Strange Adventures. So, like you said, I feel like there's a growing audience, not really for characters, but for writers, to where they're able to attract those kind of fans.
Sure. And
And
I
people
think,
talk, and that's the most important
yeah.
thing you got to realize too.
Yeah. I think time's a huge factor, right? So people like Jeff and people like Tom have been in the industry for a while and they've had an opportunity to where people know what their expectations are when they're reading books by Tom King or Jeff Lemire. I feel like I'm. It's just been these past 2 years that my books have been getting to a point where people are reading and forming their expectations of what to expect from a RamV book. And I think once those kind of take root, then hopefully there's enough people who actually like what they expect from a RamV book, then those will be conversations that I can have.
Right.
So yeah, I'm more excited by what stories I can tell than which characters or which franchise I can tell.
So, what kind of story are you going to tell for Venom? Kind of segueing into that, how did that project fall into your lap?
Yeah, that one was interesting. So I had a phone call with Donny Cates when he was still writing Venom, and he said, "Hey, at some point, I'm going to call time on this book. I'm going to move on to other things, but I will be asked who I would recommend for this book, and I wanted to recommend you. Would you be interested?" Um, and I said, "Yeah, I mean, I'd be interested, but I also said, I don't have a lot of background with this character. I haven't read a lot of Venom, and so I would have to come up with like a really interesting take." So fast forward, several years from that, and Devin, who's the editor at Marvel, reached out to me and said, "Hey, we've been chatting. Donnie's gonna step off this book after issue 200, and so we wanted to see if you'd be interested." Um, and at first, I was like, "Look, this is coming at a really busy time, and I gotta figure out if I can actually do another book." And as I was considering this, Devin goes, "Yeah, Al's going to be writing a parallel thread in the book." And so I said, "Oh, well, if it's going to be collaborating with Al, yeah, absolutely, 100%." And once I knew that, I knew there was scope to reinvent and take more interesting angles than there have been in the past. So I knew I was going to be pitching Dylan Brock's story, so I said I want to take a road trip across America with the boy trying to find his father while wearing his father's jacket, learning where his father picked up the scars and scuff marks along the way. And I think at the heart, although it might not be apparent, it'll still have all these symbiotes and aliens and evil Marvel villains trying to thwart our plans. At the heart of it, it's a story about a kid growing up looking for his father, if you will.
Right. Which is great. Dylan was a character that I loved from Donny Cates's Venom. What I found a little more interesting was the use of the Maker and kind of like the teaser that we
Mm-hmm.
saw going forward. If you could speak on that.
I don't believe the Maker was in the teaser that
Was it?
Al and I put
It
out.
was in Venom 200, I believe. Wasn't the back pages of that?
Well, we'll have to wait and see where that leads. As far as because I can't talk about anything that's not in the teaser that Al and I put out. I would much rather keep that for the story for people to discover as they come to it. But I can say this: there's a lot of interesting threads in Donnie's run and runs that came prior to Donnie that I can see being pulled together to do something interesting. And so, yeah, absolutely expect to see connective tissue to Donnie's run and connective tissue to things that came before that. So
um,
hopefully
well,
that's an all-encompassing answer. Yeah,
that is an all-encompassing aspect because for me, I'm like thinking straight. Okay, I know how much Al Ewing loves writing sci-fi and
yeah,
loves being expansive that in the Ultimates. And we've seen Brian Hitch be around for a
mm-hmm.
very long time since the Ultimate Universe is really founded. He was one of the leading artists. So I can't help
Yeah.
but think, are we going to get all those Ultimate Universe vibes with RamV's amazing storytelling and ways of foreshadowing
Well,
things?
I think it's going to be interesting. I think my story is going to very much have my vibe to it. It's going to be. I don't necessarily think there's value in signaling towards things that came in the past if there isn't like a story driven reason to do so.
Right.
Um, but you know of Al's canon and his voice and his interests. Um, and the way we're doing this, I think this is public knowledge at this point, is Al's going to be writing Eddie Brock's story, and it's Eddie Brock in space. And I'm going to be writing Dylan's story, and it's Dylan on Earth. And those two stories are kind of going to run parallelly and then unexpectedly twine
Right.
and push each other and pull each other and influence each other um, to a point where eventually they become inseparable from each other and the things that happen in each narrative have consequences for characters that are in the other narrative, if you will. So that's how we're writing it. So if anything, it's going to be entirely new, entirely unexpected, and yet coming from places that people are expectedly familiar with.
That's the best kind of writing is when there's something that is obvious, right? Or that's supposed to be there in the pages, but you don't look at it until later and you're like, oh, I'm an idiot. It was right there the whole time.
Right,
To me, that's the way like Jonathan Hickman is very good at reminding us from
right.
House and Powers of X. But what is your biggest what's the biggest thing that draws you to Dylan as a character?
I think it's that sense of being lost and having to figure stuff out for yourself, and not knowing if things are going to be okay. Um, I've been there. I've been this teenager who came over to the states, to study engineering. Had knew absolutely no one and had to figure stuff out for myself. And I think there's a universality in that in that age late teens, mid to late teens, where you're growing up, where you realize you're going to be making choices that are going to be your choices and your responsibilities, and you're gonna have to deal with your own regrets and your own mistakes, if you will. And so, I think to me, to look at a superhero finding themselves in that time in their lives is always super interesting.
100%. Yeah, I like how Dylan is very independent, or he became more independent in the beginning when he was introduced. He was very much tethered to his father and looking for that relationship. But I think over time and kind of growing up with Normie, that we saw very subtly, he's becoming really his own voice and really trying to
Mm-hmm.
see for himself, but has yet to figure out what he wants to do,
Yeah.
which I think is a problem amongst most teenagers. Is kind of that self discovery because there are a
Yeah, it's
billion
such an
jobs out there.
exciting, but it's
Yeah.
also such an exciting time to write stories in for people, you know. Yeah.
What's going on, Bryce? That's the co-host to Weekly Wrap Up, the better half of this channel. Welcome, Bryce. You should be in school right now, though, but that's a different story. Not a he didn't read the Donny Cates run, but yelling at him for that. But after Swamp Thing, Laila Starr, like I said, if you guys ever do want to check out Weekly Wrap Up, RamV's always there. RamV is always on the show. Um, I also like this question. Any chance that you would be interested in writing Phantom X or Exorn or Zorn, however you
Yeah,
pronounce
like I said, my interest stems from stories.
it?
So
Right.
if you'd asked any chance, I'd be telling very Morrison-esque stories, 100%.
So, who is a character that you think should be brought back either in the Marvel universe or DC universe that we have not seen in forever?
No, no, no. That's a trick question because I've got pitches out for those characters with
Uh,
Marvel and DC. So I'm not going to be talking about that. But um, I will say this: I have a big soft spot for characters that I feel like their power set has been underutilized, or that you haven't quite thought of what these characters are really capable of. Um, yeah, I'll leave it at that.
I'm like in my head right now. I'm sure everyone in the chat are just cycling through a bunch of people right there.
Yeah, like I'll give you an example because this is definitely a book I'm not doing right now. No one ever questions the fact that Doctor Strange's magic comes from a very specific place. It is a derivative of Indian magic and Buddhist influences. And there's a whole mythology that is unexplored and prevalent in India that has never been touched on, even though his magic seems to come from weird sounding gods. Like, what do those names mean? Where does that magic come from? No one's touched on it. And I feel like there's so much potential to dig into magic that comes from India and Indian mythology. No, it's not Jubilee.
I don't know. I don't know if I should be very excited that maybe one day we'll get a RamV Doctor Strange book because that's one of my favorite characters, and I haven't really had an enjoyable Doctor Strange story and since Jason Aaron really or Johnny
Mm.
Cates. So I'm just like, could we get one maybe in the
Well,
future?
the
Or I'm
reason I
like,
gave
oh
that
man,
example
he's
is
not doing
because I'm definitely
it.
not doing a Doctor Strange story
But I'm like,
right
dang,
now.
because I feel like Doctor Strange is a character that is really utilized best when there's an audience or like when there's a writer who says, I have something to say about this character,
Sure.
which I felt like
But
Marvel
that
can.
is, to be honest, that is true of most stories. Like, why write a story if you don't have something specific to say through it? Your
True.
personal motivations have to come through. So,
Right.
just 1 second. I'm gonna shut my door. Give me a second, please. Sorry.
No problem. No problem. I knew there was like some background noise. What's going on? Thank you guys so much. Okay, you're back.
Yeah,
Thank you
go
guys so
for it.
much for being here. But yeah, we're talking about Doctor Strange. I feel like a lot of times, especially lately in the past few years, Doctor Strange has been usually because he's in the MCU, we should have a book here.
Mm.
A lot of times stories can I don't want to say feel forced or like kind of feel like, okay, we're just keeping this going, right? For Doctor Strange, I feel like there's more of if you really have a Doctor Strange story, right, rather than like an ongoing. every few years have a new one coming out.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, any story that's being written just because you want to keep it going is not going to read well. I think if you're going to write a story, regardless of what motivation you have behind it, you have to write for the reasons of I have something to say with this story. Um, so yeah,
Um, but I like this question too. Hasn't Marvel turned down the strength of Doctor
it's
Strange's
magic.
magic?
There is no turning up or
Turning,
down the strength of magic. It's magic.
turning. Um. What's going on, Robbie? Good to see you today.
What's up, Robbie?
Um, but man, you've been doing a lot of. Are we gonna get more? Many Deaths, Layla Starr. Is there any plans of that in the works?
No, it's a story about death. If it doesn't end, then I've kind of failed at writing my story.
There you go. And are there any comic recommendations? That was a question above that I can't pull up now because it's so far back. But were there any comic recommendations that you had that you really enjoyed that brought you kind of back into reading?
Of stuff that's already out there, I think Kieran Gillen's Die and Once and Future are both excellent books that people should read. Al's Immortal Hulk was certainly an incredible breath of fresh air when I read it, which was great. Department of Truth from James Tynion has been great. And although this isn't out yet, everyone should go and pre-order. I want to make sure I get the name right. So everyone should go and pre-order Arkham City that's coming out from DC Comics.
Yes.
It's written by Dan Waters with art by Danny. And I have read issue 1 of this because Dan's a good friend and sends me all his PDFs. And my recommendation is of the very highest order. Go get it.
And I can't speak about anything coming in the pipeline because I know sometimes I announce the next guests on Creators Corner, but I can't say anything about that yet because we haven't gotten a date. But stay tuned for that and stay tuned for more because this has been a great show. But Ram, going forward, are there any last words you have to say about Venom or anything that we spoke about today that you want to throw out there?
No, I just want to say, I've already kind of dropped a hint at upcoming stuff, and I just want to say that I'm really appreciative of people who have sought out and found my books and have recommended them to their friends. I've never been the kind of guy who's very good at generating hype, if you will, and I felt like my focus on my work has been predominantly the thing that I've been good at, and so I very much depend on people who are reading the stuff who enjoy it,
right?
To speak about the books, and I guess I just want to say I'm super appreciative of that.
Right, and shout out to Jen, Comics Will Break Your Heart, who has preached the Many Days of Laila Starr across everyone, and
that's what I mean. Thank you, Jen.
With all the threats that she gave us for if you didn't pick up Many Days of Laila Starr, I appreciate it because it was a great story. But Ram, thank you so much for being here. It was an absolute pleasure. You are welcome back anytime on the show. Thank you so much to the chat for being here. Makes you continue to support RamV's work. Makes you continue to support the channel, support each other, because that's really what it's all about. Ram, thank you so much again.
Pleasure, sir. Thank you for having me.